Was the invocation of the Emergencies Act legitimate? I'm Marco Perry. Welcome to the Perry Platform. One thing I think we can all agree on is that times are strange right now. The Trudeau government has invoked the Emergencies Act to end anti-lockdown, anti-vaccine mandate protests that are currently occurring across the country. These demonstrations do come in many forms, some of which many of us condemn, including myself, such as the blockades on critical infrastructure. That's illegal. Such as harassment of people and medical staff. That's illegal. But there's also forms of protest that just are protest. That's legal. You have every right to piss off politicians. You have every right to gather in the groups that you see fit in as large of a capacity as you want. That all is and should be allowed. There is nuances here within this broad freedom convoy, or whatever you want to call it. And the government, to my eye, has failed to make that distinction. There is a difference that is not being factored in with their response. There are people who are obstructing economic activity within various locations that have to be cleared out. But there are also those who are peacefully protesting. And when you look at the ratio of who's doing what, it's not clear that the Emergencies Act was required. And before we get too deep into this, I just want to say, personally, I've actually defended government lockdowns before. I don't have an affiliation with the Freedom Convoy. I'm not arguing from a biased standpoint. In fact, I would say I'm more in the middle, trying to be at least a little bit objective about this here. The lockdowns to me made sense, especially at the beginning of the pandemic. We had no idea to what extent this virus was going to cause harm. Perhaps now the equation has changed and I'm willing to hear that. I'm not entirely swayed by the protesters, and I may even agree that out in the ether it's generally a dumb idea to gather in large groups while we have the rapidly spreading Omicron variant just wreaking havoc. I have no horse in seeing this organization succeed. Yet, I also realize the stupidity of the Trudeau and the federal government for invoking an act meant to quell true emergencies when, clearly, there are other options that could have been taken here. When clearly a targeted approach to deal with things that are already illegal, like blockades, like harassment, could have been deployed. This blanket sweep that is going to penalize regular protesters and even those who have donated to the cause, even if you never even showed up to a protest, you gave $10. You've become a target. That's silly. We have to go back to basics here. In a democratic country, the right to protest only means something if people can exercise it to promote things that the government, that popular media, and perhaps even the majority of citizens don't agree with. They have that right. And you have the right to call them out. You have the right to say that they're fools. We have the right to tear apart illegal blockades. We have the right to request that harassment not be present. But they have the right to gather. They have the right to peacefully protest, and many of them have done that. The average protester isn't here trying to storm the Capitol. Simply put, they're fed up with the current state of existence. They want to get back to normal life, and they may have been attracted to this movement as the means of doing so. And of course, other fools may have been attracted to it as well, those on the alt-right. But, as I said before, there are many elements to this convoy, and not all of them are equally bad, and there are responses to deal with the ones that are. Canada does not look liberal, democratic, or level-headed at this point in time. Even more so when we analyze the government's ability to do things like arbitrarily seize people's bank accounts for being quote-unquote affiliated with the protest. That's one of the powers given to them through the Emergencies Act. Now, the Canadian Civil Liberties Association says it does not believe the high and clear threshold needed to invoke the act has been met. The law states that it can only be used when a situation cannot be dealt with using any other law in the country. And I agree with their assessment. Trudeau must have lost his mind here. What's going on out there does not meet the threshold needed to invoke this act. And let's just rewind for a bit here and talk about what exactly this thing is. The Emergencies Act was passed in 1988, and it authorizes the federal government to take extraordinary, temporary measures to respond to public welfare emergencies, public order emergencies, international emergencies, and war emergencies. So emergencies. Is the current protest an emergency? That is the first thing you have to ask yourself. Now, going on, the act is only usable in circumstances that cannot be dealt with by any existing law. Is that true? Some of the primary hindrances and annoyances here, like the blockades, are those legal? No, they're not. Were there existing laws that can deal with it? I believe so. The harassment, yeah, that's already illegal. So what exactly are we talking about here? And further, you have to meet that criteria. And either is beyond the capacity of a province to deal with, or threatens the sovereignty of Canada. And this is the only time we've seen this act used, in response to the Convoy protest. Before this act, we did have something else called the War Measures Act, which had to be reformed when a group, that one that you might have heard of actually, the FLQ, was going around kidnapping government officials. And let's be honest here, if an FLQ type situation did occur, there may be a case for the Emergency Act declaration. The trucker protest is not even in the same conceptual realm. I might have to remind people, the FLQ was an extremist, militant group who did things like bomb a stock exchange, who did things like kidnap people. They robbed, and they literally terrorized a province. Is that comparable? That's one of the standards to what's going on today? I'm not so sure. And once again, I do agree with the Canadian Civil Liberties group there. It doesn't seem so. Now, of course, we're not fortune tellers. I can only base that stance upon what's currently transpired. It's perfectly reasonable to imagine that at some future point things do escalate, but we don't live in the world of Minority Report, where future crimes are things you can be charged for today. If these things have not escalated to that point, there is no need to enact the Emergencies Act just yet. Now, why do I say that? Because the powers within it bestow things to the government that resemble an authoritarian regime. For 30 days, Trudeau can prohibit public gatherings, for example. So in other words, he can take away your right to protest. He can ban that. And I'm not just talking about the blockades or the harassment, which we've already gone over, were already illegal. We're talking about people just standing around Parliament Hill doing things that would occur at a regular protest. He can prohibit these people and their right to travel, violating mobility rights. He can prohibit their use of various types of property, which include their own money. He required banks to suspend or freeze accounts suspected of supporting the blockades. So now it's just not even going after the people who are blockading. It's protesters in general, and even those who supported them. So maybe just the average Joe who liked the message, gave $10, is at risk now of having their account frozen and their life ruined without a warrant, without going to court, without having a hearing. And the government can do that at a whim. Once again, you have to assume that they're actually going to target people who are affiliated with the protest, that they won't make a mistake, that it's even a legitimate thing to do in the first place. And I disagree with all of that. This is quite scary. Further, under threat of law, Trudeau can force organizations to act in certain ways. For example, he can command tow drivers to comply with his will, or they'll face a legal penalty. There's been stories of tow truck drivers saying, no, we're not going to tow these blockades. Well, now with the act passing, you have no choice, unless you want to get fined or go to jail. What's happened is he's essentially written himself a blank check to do whatever he wants to people, violate all their rights, seize their property, all with no consequences nor liability. This is done, as I've said, without even a trial or conviction. Innocent until proven guilty flies out the window, and if you are simply suspected of being involved, quote unquote, you can lose your financial assets and be jailed. This is not how a free country operates. To sharpen up the point a little bit here, it's not to say that there is no such thing as emergencies. If a group like the FLQ emerged who were bombing buildings, kidnapping government officials, like they were doing things along these lines, then of course there might be a case to take extraordinary measures to curb that. But we're just not at that point, and there are laws and protocols already in place that could quell these blockades and whatnot. But the protests are separate. Those shouldn't be touched. You are free to say it's stupid. You're free to show up and do a counter protest. You're free to say whatever you want about it. You don't have to agree with it. I don't agree with every protest that happens. There are dumb protests, but still, people have that right in a democratic society, and it should be upheld. But we do have a trend here of erasing democratic norms. Now, the Canadian Civil Liberties Association is rightfully taking Trudeau to court over this. They plainly say this move threatens our democracy and, of course, our civil liberties. It's a terrible precedent to set. The government is acting not in accordance with reality. And that's 100% accurate. This is disgraceful. And I am glad our civil liberties group has a spine here. Now, once again, just to reiterate the point, the convoy isn't entirely noble in their own right. There's certainly things there that one can critique. There may in fact be illegal things happening, but protesting isn't part of that bucket. You don't have to like, support, or appreciate their stance to realize just how radical of a move enacting the Emergencies Act is. Don't forget what a free country looks like. Don't forget what a democracy is supposed to stand for. And don't forget the reputation that Canada has worked so hard to build up for itself, and recognize the very real peril a move like this presents. Today, it might be people that you hate who are the ones being trampled by RCMP officers and having their private property seized without a warrant or intelligible reason. But tomorrow, perhaps it's you, with a cause that you really care about, but is deemed unsavory. We need to be more mature as a country. People need outlets to express themselves, and when things get tense, a militant response from the government cannot be the norm. If you were to take the facts of the matter and simply swap the country of Canada with one that is more authoritarian, you would say just another day there for them. But to see Canada associated with things like seizing people's private property without warrants, to see Canada doing something like forcefully disbanding a protest, perfectly fine to disband a blockade, but a general protest, to have people who simply supported the general cause and donated a sum to them, living in fear that they may have their accounts frozen and they can't afford to buy dinner or pay their rent, that's insanity. And we've certainly lowered the bar for ourselves here by taking part in this. Needless to say, I do hope the Civil Liberties Association wins their lawsuit and Trudeau faces reputational harm for what he's done here. This is crazy. But time will tell. And there are some signs that are somewhat alarming. I've seen a poll that something as high as 2/3 of Canadians support the use of the Emergencies Act here. Now, there are margins of error, but I can only hope the number isn't that high. Just think about what this means and extract your personal sentiments towards this protest and think about things more objectively. Think about how a government being able to do something like this as a normal response to protests that they don't like could be harmful to groups in the future. How it could impact you perhaps one day. If you don't want a government to have a certain power that could be wielded against you, to subjugate you, well, don't give it to them in the first place, because you may like Trudeau a lot, but the next leader might not be so favorable to you. Now, with that, it does bring us to the end of our conversation for today. If you enjoyed the material, be sure to leave a review and share. That'll help us grow. And you can find me online at perryplatform.org and on social media at perryplatform. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you soon.